Chaos erupted in a Dallas courtroom this morning when Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, appearing not as a lawmaker but as a defendant in a minor civil dispute, shocked the court by representing herself, exposing judicial misconduct, and igniting a legal firestorm that now threatens to upend the city's justice system. What began with laughter ended in handcuffs. But not for her. The courtroom was already buzzing when Jasmine Crockett walked through the double doors of the Dallas County Civil Court at 9:13 a.m. Dressed in a sleek navy pantsuit, no entourage, no security, no lawyer by her side, she drew every eye in the room. The murmurs weren't out of respect. They were laced with cynicism. Whispers rippled through the pews as if people couldn't believe she had actually shown up to fight a civil citation herself. The case? A seemingly insignificant dispute over a zoning fine related to the fencing around a community shelter she personally helped fund on the South Side. On paper, a minor city code violation. In reality, a matchstick on dry timber. She wasn't supposed to win. She wasn't even supposed to put up a fight. And Judge Ronald B. Halcroft made that clear within the first 5 minutes. "Well, Judge," Halcroft said as he squinted over his bench, adjusting his glasses and smirking in front of a nearly packed courtroom, "this is certainly unorthodox. A sitting member of Congress choosing to act as her own counsel over a fence violation. Are we auditioning for television, Ms. Crockett?" A ripple of laughter followed, mostly from city attorneys and a few reporters seated in the back. Jasmine didn't flinch. "No, Your Honor, but I do believe in handling my business directly, especially when it concerns constituents and the selective enforcement of city ordinances." That sentence alone seemed to set the tone. Halcroft straightened slightly, his smirk thinning, but he still wore the crown of a man who believed this proceeding was a mere formality. A performative exercise he could swat away by lunchtime. He didn't expect her to arrive with a meticulously organized case file, complete with time-stamped photographs, city planning board correspondences, and testimony from 3 neighboring business owners contradicting the city's claim. He certainly didn't expect her to cite Dallas Municipal Code 48-3001 Section B, a clause so niche even the city's legal rep had to Google it on her tablet. By 10:40 a.m., the laughter in the courtroom had died. People stopped whispering, and as Jasmine cross-examined the city inspector who issued the citation, the room leaned forward, silent. The inspector fumbled on the stand. His timeline didn't add up. His report had no photographic evidence, despite the city's claims. Worse, his answers changed under pressure. "Inspector," Jasmine said, her voice crisp and unshaken, "can you explain why your report says the inspection occurred on March 3rd, but the timestamp on the violation letter is dated February 28th? The inspector blinked. I may have made a mistake. You may have issued a violation before inspecting the property?" He hesitated. "That's not what I'm saying, but that's what it looks like, isn't it?" Objections from the city were overruled. The judge leaned back in his chair, suddenly stone-faced, no longer smirking, not laughing, watching. And he didn't like what he saw. When the court broke for recess at noon, Jasmine stood near the water cooler alone. A few people nodded at her as they passed, but most kept their distance. The city's legal team huddled in a corner, whispering furiously. One reporter tweeted, "Crockett isn't just holding her own. She's schooling the court." Judge Halcroft looked shook. By the time court resumed, the judge's tone had changed. He interrupted Jasmine more often, sustained every objection the city threw. He even chastised her for referring to precedent rulings, accusing her of grandstanding, but she didn't let it rattle her. Then came the oddest moment yet. An anonymous note was slid beneath the door of the courtroom during a short recess. The bailiff delivered it directly to Halcroft, who paused as he read it. His face froze. Then, without a word, he handed it to a clerk, who disappeared behind chambers. The trial resumed as if nothing had happened, but the judge was off. Agitated, sharp. He dismissed Jasmine's next piece of evidence before she could explain its relevance. An email from a city employee suggesting the shelter had been unfairly targeted. "Ms. Crockett, we are not here to put the city's motivation on trial," Halcroft snapped. "I think we are, Your Honor," Jasmine replied coolly, "especially if enforcement is being applied with prejudice." "You're out of line." "No, sir. I'm in my rights. If selective enforcement is being used to penalize community work, particularly in black and brown neighborhoods, then it absolutely is on trial." The judge banged his gavel once. Then again. "This is not Capitol Hill, Congresswoman. This is my courtroom." And there it was. The shift. The veil dropped. This wasn't about zoning anymore. This was about power, image, control. As the tension in the courtroom simmered like a pressure cooker, no one noticed the young man who slipped into the gallery. During the next recess, a former court clerk turned whistleblower, nervous, eyes darting, holding a flash drive in his pocket like it was a live grenade. And he wasn't there to watch. He was there to blow it all open. The young man's name was Eric Malone, 28, former court clerk, fidgety hands, anxious, eyes, but with a back straightened by purpose. He hadn't been back in this courtroom since he resigned under mysterious circumstances 2 months ago, citing ethical conflicts in a single-sentence letter that never made the news. But today, sitting quietly in the third row behind a woman with a press badge and a retired school teacher, Eric had no intention of blending in. The flash drive in his pocket felt heavy. Not physically, it was barely an ounce, but the weight of what it contained could crush reputations, careers, and maybe even the legal foundation of the court itself. Back at the bench, Jasmine Crockett remained poised. She didn't know Eric was in the room yet, but something had shifted. Judge Halcroft's irritation had become more pointed. His objections to her evidence were no longer masked as procedural. They were personal. "Let the record reflect," Jasmine said as she paced slowly, "that the judge has struck down 4 admissible exhibits within the last hour, all directly relevant to my defense." "You're dangerously close to contempt, Ms. Crockett," Halcroft warned, his tone laced with condescension. "I'm well within my rights to challenge judicial decisions when they reflect clear bias. You don't get to call this courtroom biased just because you're losing." "Am I losing, Your Honor?" she asked, tilting her head. A low murmur rustled through the gallery. Before the judge could respond, the court officer entered through the side door and leaned into the judge's ear, whispering with urgency. Halcroft's face twitched, just barely, but enough for Jasmine to catch. He nodded once, and the officer exited. It was then that Eric stood up. He didn't shout. He didn't cause a scene. He simply walked to the front, handed a sealed manila envelope to the bailiff, and said, "This is evidence relevant to today's proceedings. It was withheld intentionally. The court needs to see it." The room froze. Jasmine's eyes narrowed. "Who are you?" she asked. "I used to work here," Eric replied. "I know how Judge Halcroft handles his paperwork, and I know what he buried." The judge slammed his gavel. "Sit down, or you'll be removed from this courtroom." But the bailiff had already opened the envelope. Inside was the flash drive, and a printed transcript of a private email conversation between Judge Halcroft and a city official discussing the zoning citation before it was officially filed. The email revealed Halcroft requesting documents be modified to ensure this case doesn't reach the appeal stage, and suggesting it would send a message if the Congresswoman was seen being put in her place. Gasps echoed. Someone in the back dropped their phone. Jasmine stepped forward slowly, cautiously, as if the courtroom had become a minefield. "Is this real?" she asked Eric directly. He nodded. "There's more on the drive. Metadata. Deleted internal. Memos." The judge altered timestamps on court files and suppressed exculpatory evidence. "This wasn't just about you. He's done it before. Dozens of times." The clerk, shaking, took the drive and delivered it to the IT tech in chambers for verification. The room fell into a strange, crackling silence, like a storm hovering just beyond the horizon. Halcroft, for the first time, looked unsure. Not angry, not commanding. Cornered. "You have no standing here, Mr. Malone," the judge barked, regaining volume but not composure. "This is an active courtroom. This is my courtroom." "Not anymore," Jasmine said, her voice like steel, under velvet. "Not when your own former clerk just exposed your hand." Halcroft pointed at her. "This entire proceeding has been turned into a circus because of your political posturing and manufactured outrage." "No," Jasmine said calmly, stepping up to the bench now. "What turned this into a circus was your belief that you could humiliate a black woman in public and no one would notice." A low rumble of voices filled the space. Someone clapped, once before being hushed. "Order!" the judge yelled. "I will not have this devolve into grandstanding. Bailiff, remove that man." The door to the courtroom burst open again. This time it was the court's lead IT technician, visibly out of breath. He held a printed document in one hand and the flash drive in the other. "Your Honor," he said flatly, "the data's real, unaltered. We traced it through internal servers. There's correspondence here that violates multiple codes of judicial conduct, including attempts to influence city policy decisions outside court authority." Silence. Absolute. Jasmine turned, addressing the courtroom. "Not just Halcroft. Let me be perfectly clear. I did not come here for a spectacle. I came here to answer a citation. I came alone. No media team, no legal entourage, just me and the facts. But what I walked into was a courtroom that had already decided my guilt before I even opened my mouth." She paused. Her voice cracked just slightly. "This is what women of color face in courtrooms across America. Assumed incompetence, condescension, silencing. But today, you picked the wrong one." Judge Halcroft's hands clenched the edge of his bench, knuckles white. But words failed him. The city's attorney stepped forward, pale and stiff. We request a recess." "No," Jasmine countered. "We proceed. I want this all on record." As the bailiff escorted Eric to the witness stand to give a sworn statement, Judge Halcroft remained frozen in place, no longer in control, no longer untouchable. He didn't know it yet, but outside the courtroom, news trucks had started lining the street. The tip-off from an anonymous source had reached the local affiliate minutes earlier. Inside, Jasmine sat quietly again, still calm, still alone. But now, the courtroom wasn't laughing, and she wasn't fighting just for herself anymore. By 2:07 p.m., the courtroom had transformed from a dull procedural stage into a live-wire political theater, packed with reporters, legal observers, and everyday citizens who had caught wind of the chaos on local news alerts and rushed over. Security had doubled. The judge's clerks were visibly nervous, whispering and shuffling papers in bursts of frantic motion. But the epicenter of the tension was still Jasmine Crockett. Calm, unmoved, seated at the defense table as if she belonged behind that bench more than the man occupying it. Eric Malone took the witness stand under oath, eyes darting across the courtroom. He was scared, clearly, but he wasn't backing down. "Mr. Malone," Jasmine began, standing tall as she stepped into the center of the courtroom, "you stated under oath that Judge Halcroft deliberately altered records tied to my case. Can you confirm the date you first noticed the tampering?" Eric nodded. "February 24th. That's when I first saw an internal directive come through with altered timestamps on the zoning violation reports. I flagged it, but I was told to let it go. When I pressed further, I was locked out of my admin access the next morning. Who locked you out?" "The court's lead administrator. But I believe the order came from Judge Halcroft himself. We had a conversation the day before. He made it clear this was a sensitive case, and that Congresswoman Crockett needed a reminder she wasn't above the law. Jasmine turned to face the bench. Your Honor, is that accurate? Halcroft leaned forward slowly, carefully. That statement is hearsay, and I will not dignify it with a response. It's not hearsay if the court's own internal logs confirm Mr. Malone's access was revoked the morning after he questioned file integrity, Jasmine shot back. Would you like me to have the logs submitted into evidence? He didn't answer. Just narrowed his eyes and leaned back in his chair, his silence stretching louder than anything he could have said. The courtroom waited, breath held, mouths shut. Mr. Malone, Jasmine continued, you also claimed Judge Halcroft had a pattern of targeting specific defendants. Can you elaborate? Eric nodded again. Yes. There were cases involving Black and Hispanic women, especially ones tied to community organizations or political movements, that were red-flagged on the docket. Certain motions would go missing. Hearings would be rescheduled without notice. Judges don't normally have access to make those changes manually, but Halcroft does. He used his override key. Gasps again. Halcroft reached for his gavel but paused, realizing the futility of trying to beat back a wildfire with a wooden hammer. You've said enough, the judge finally said to Eric. You're a disgruntled former employee. You were let go for inappropriate access to sealed records. The court won't entertain the delusions of a bitter ex-staffer. I resigned, Eric snapped. You signed the acknowledgement yourself. You wanted me gone because I knew too much. I will not be accused by an amateur whistleblower who doesn't understand how the judicial system works, Halcroft snarled. You mean the system you've been rigging from the inside? Jasmine asked, her voice sharp, cutting through, the judge's facade like glass. Because from where we're sitting, it looks like you've been playing God with people's lives, and getting away with it. The gallery murmured again, louder this time, as cell phones buzzed and fingers typed madly into screens. A reporter stood up without permission. Congresswoman Crockett, would you be willing to call for a formal investigation into Judge Halcroft's conduct? The judge pounded his gavel. Sit down. This is not a press conference. But Jasmine turned and looked the reporter directly in the eye. Yes, I will. On record. The room practically vibrated. Courtroom protocol was breaking down, and the man once perched at the top of the system was scrambling to stop his descent. You have no authority to initiate an investigation, Halcroft said bitterly, but his voice had lost its weight. I do as a sitting member of Congress. I've already filed preliminary papers with the House Judiciary Committee, she replied. That was the first time Halcroft visibly recoiled. The court officer stepped toward the bench again, whispering with tense urgency. Halcroft's eyes darted toward the door, where a pair of city ethics officials had just entered the back row. A legal observer from the state bar was already scribbling in a leather notebook. It was unraveling fast. Your Honor, Jasmine said, her voice steady and low, for years defendants have walked into this courtroom thinking they were getting a fair shot, when instead they were walking into a rigged game. You are making dangerous allegations, he said, though the growl in his voice had softened into something closer to a plea. I'm making factual allegations, Jasmine corrected, backed by digital records, sworn testimony, and a mountain of suspicious case patterns. She stepped closer to the bench. And let me ask you directly, sir. How many poor women of color did you let drown in this courtroom because they didn't know the system was stacked against them? The judge's mouth opened, but nothing came out. His robe suddenly looked too big on him, like it belonged to a man with far more dignity than he currently possessed. A court clerk approached the bench with a sealed file folder in her hands and whispered, "We need to talk." "No," Halcroft snapped. "We are not recessing. Not now." "You may want to," she whispered. Behind her, Jasmine stood still, her arms crossed now, not in defense, but defiance. She had spent her entire legal and political career advocating for fairness, For the first time, the system she once fought to improve had shown its hand, and she was ready to burn the deck. At 3:26 p.m., a legal representative from the State Commission on Judicial Conduct formally approached the court and requested an in-camera hearing to review immediate disciplinary action. For the first time in his career, Judge Halcroft looked like he was waiting for a verdict himself. "I suggest a recess," Jasmine said with the faintest trace of a smile. The judge said nothing. The gavel, once the loudest voice in the room, now lay untouched. Judge Ronald B. Halcroft sat motionless, his jaw tight, his eyes staring past the courtroom into some place of retreat inside his own head. He looked like a statue cracking under pressure, his once imperious presence eroding with each passing second. But the room wasn't waiting. The representative from the State Commission on Judicial Conduct, a sharp-eyed woman named Darlene Voss, stepped fully into the courtroom. She wore no robe, no badge, just the kind of quiet authority that didn't require one. She walked down the center aisle with two other officials at her back, passing stunned observers and murmuring clerks until she reached the bench. "We are requesting an emergency review of this judge's conduct," she said, loud enough for all to hear. "Your Honor, we suggest you recuse yourself from further proceedings until a preliminary investigation is complete." Halcroft's voice came at last, brittle but audible. "This is highly irregular." "Not as irregular as tampering with evidence," Darlene snapped back. "We have a whistleblower, an authenticated digital trail, and now 2 active complaints from attorneys who claim similar manipulation occurred in prior cases." Gasps again. More phones out, more whispers. "I will not be railroaded in my own courtroom," Halcroft hissed. "You come in here, mid-proceeding, and try to strip me of authority based on the word of a disgraced clerk and a self-interested congresswoman?" "You're under investigation, not prosecution," Darlene replied sharply. "But if you continue to obstruct, we will escalate. I suggest you step aside." "I won't." His voice cracked at the edge of defiance and desperation. Halcroft stood suddenly, pushing back his chair, the wood scraping across the elevated platform like a scream. The room jumped. For a split second it looked as though he might walk out, storm off in the middle of his own unraveling. But he didn't. Instead, he reached for a thick leather folder at the side of his bench, opened it with theatrical flair, and began flipping through the pages. He was grasping now, desperate for control. "Let the record reflect that this proceeding has become politically contaminated. The defense is attempting to assassinate my character because she cannot win on merit." Jasmine stood, slow and deliberate. "The only thing that's been assassinated is trust in your courtroom. You're grandstanding again, Ms. Crockett." "No," she said, stepping forward. "I'm standing up. There's a difference." The city's lead attorney, who had remained awkwardly silent through the storm, now stepped forward, clearly unsure of where her loyalty should lie. "Your Honor, I think it's best we pause for the day." "You don't get to think, Counselor. You're not running this courtroom." "No," Jasmine cut in. "But it's becoming increasingly clear you're not either." The gallery, which had been holding its collective breath, erupted in soft but palpable murmurs. Jasmine turned, back to the courtroom, locking eyes with the people watching from every corner. The students, the elders, the reporters, the staffers. People who had seen judges act above reproach for decades. This isn't just about me or offense violation, or a bad ruling. This is about who gets to wield power, and how easily that power can be bent toward personal bias, Jasmine said. "How many women came in here without representation, without digital records, without a whistleblower in the gallery?" Halcroft's face flushed, and he pointed a shaking finger at her. "You're undermining public trust in the judiciary." She stepped closer to the bench. "You already did that. I'm just bringing it into the light." For a long moment the judge said nothing. No defense, no denial, only silence. The walls of his legacy were closing in, one allegation at a time. Then, with a sudden motion, he slammed the folder shut and sat down again. Not out of defiance this time, but defeat. His shoulders slumped ever so slightly, the weight of consequence beginning to settle. "We will reconvene tomorrow," he muttered. But even the bailiff hesitated. The court no longer moved at his command. Darlene Voss leaned in and whispered something, sliding a sealed document across the bench. It was a temporary order of judicial review, an internal protocol that, while not an outright suspension, stripped Halcroft of administrative authority pending investigation. He paled. "You're not running this docket tomorrow, Judge," she said quietly. "A provisional judge will be assigned, effective immediately." And just like that, the bench, the symbol of Halcroft's decades-long rule, was no longer his. The bailiff's radio crackled to life. The words weren't clear, but the urgency was unmistakable. Something had shifted outside. A court clerk rushed to the side door and opened it. One of the courthouse's senior ethics monitors entered with a handheld tablet and an envelope. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said. "May I have a moment?" Jasmine raised an eyebrow but walked toward him calmly. He held out the envelope and showed her the screen. "What is this?" she asked. "A record," he said. "Your zoning case was flagged for deletion this morning before the trial began. Someone tried to erase it from the court system entirely." Her eyes went wide, her jaw tightening. "Was it deleted?" "No, but only because the system flagged it as active. Otherwise, it would have disappeared." "Who made the request?" He hesitated. "There's a digital signature." He turned the screen toward her. "Ronald B. Halcroft." Fresh shockwave rippled through the room as Jasmine turned to face the courtroom again, her voice now electric. Not only did he try to rig the outcome, he tried to erase the case altogether. This man wasn't trying to make a legal point. He was trying to make me disappear. The courtroom roared. Some stood, others shouted. One woman in the gallery shouted, "Arrest him!" before being quieted by security. Cameras from the local news crew captured every second. Judge Halcroft stood again, this time with the full weight of his unraveling on his shoulders. He looked at Jasmine, then at Eric, then at the courtroom. Dozens of eyes watching the fall of a man who once sat above them all. "You think you've won," he muttered. "No," Jasmine said, turning to face him squarely. "I think we've just begun." The sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the corridor beyond the doors. Uniforms, a legal officer, and handcuffs. For a long, breathless second, the entire courtroom hovered in suspended animation. The atmosphere was so charged, it seemed, even the air itself waited, held taut between reckoning and denial. Then the door creaked open. 2 state law enforcement officers stepped inside, flanked by a senior court-martial. Their presence sent a visible shudder through the room. One of the officers, a composed Latina woman with firm eyes and a calm voice, stepped forward and addressed the bench. Judge Ronald B. Halcroft, pursuant to an emergency order issued by the Texas State Commission on Judicial Conduct and in accordance with evidence presented today in court, you are being taken into custody for the purposes of further investigation into obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, and abuse of judicial authority. A collective exhale swept through the gallery, some gasping, some murmuring, others simply stunned into silence. "I will not be paraded out of here like some criminal," Halcroft growled, his voice cracking. "You don't get to dictate the terms anymore," Jasmine said softly, but loud enough for everyone to hear. His eyes flicked toward her. No more smirk, no more pomp. Just a man being reduced to what he had always believed himself immune to: accountability. The officers ascended the bench platform as Halcroft stumbled back half a step, still attempting to gather the shreds of dignity he'd clung to throughout the trial. "I have served this court with distinction for 29 years, he said, eyes scanning the room as if someone, anyone, might leap to his defense. No one did. Instead, the bailiff who had once stood loyally by his side took a half-step away. The court reporter lowered her eyes. The clerk stood motionless, lips pressed tight. The silence was definitive. "You served it, yes," Jasmine said, rising from her seat. "But justice, that's another story." The metallic click of the handcuffs was louder than expected, a blunt punctuation mark at the end of Halcroft's reign. The officers moved quickly but respectfully, turning him toward the doors, now lined with camera flashes from reporters squeezed, shoulder to shoulder in the hallway. The judge who had once mocked Jasmine from the bench was now being walked out past her, wrists bound, gaze lowered. As he passed her, he stopped. He looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time. "You don't know what you've started," he said. Jasmine didn't flinch. "I know exactly what I've started." And then he was gone. The courtroom erupted, not in chaos, but in applause. Not thunderous, but steady. A release. A rare moment in American justice where truth hadn't been bent or buried, but laid, bare, loudly, and without apology. Jasmine remained still for a moment longer before turning to Eric, who had remained frozen at the witness stand, eyes wide, disbelief still written across his face. "You did the hard part," she told him. He shook his head. "You made it matter." Outside, a press conference had already formed on the courthouse steps. Dozens of reporters held out microphones as Jasmine exited to a flurry of questions. "Congresswoman Crockett, will you press charges beyond the ethics board? Will this trigger a federal investigation? Did you expect this outcome today?" She paused only when the crowd quieted slightly and one question cut through the rest. "Why did you choose to represent yourself?" She smiled, a tired but powerful smile, and stepped to the mic. "I chose to represent myself because I needed people to see this for what it really was. A broken system that punishes the people it's supposed to protect, especially women of color, especially those who don't have the resources to fight back. This wasn't about offense. It wasn't about zoning. It was about a system that weaponizes silence, technicalities, and bias. Cameras snapped, pens scratched. We talk about justice like it's a place, but it's not a place. It's a practice. And today, we practiced it. Loudly, publicly, and without compromise. That soundbite would loop across cable news and social media feeds for the next week. But back inside the courthouse, in a smaller room tucked behind chambers, representatives from the state commission and civil rights attorneys were already convening. The fallout came fast. Within 72 hours, a full review was launched into Judge Halcroft's docket over the last 10 years. Nearly 24 convictions and rulings, mostly involving minority defendants, were placed under emergency appeal. The district attorney announced cooperation with the review. The governor's office issued a cautious but supportive statement, calling for judicial transparency. More importantly, momentum had shifted. A special judicial oversight panel was formed by the state legislature, tasked with auditing every court in Dallas County over the next 2 years. Within the month, new legislation was introduced to make judicial misconduct easier to report, anonymously, and without retaliation. Mandatory bias training for judges and clerks was passed, and a whistleblower protection fund was seeded to encourage others, like Eric, to step forward without risking ruin. Jasmine returned to Washington not as a defendant, but as a reformer. She introduced the Fair Courtroom Practices Act, a federal bill that sought to establish national protocols for judicial oversight and transparency, one rooted in her very experience. The bill garnered rare bipartisan attention, with senators across the aisle quietly acknowledging what most had long suspected but rarely confronted. Justice wasn't just blind. Sometimes it was willfully negligent. Months later, at a community center in South Dallas, the same one whose fence sparked this entire saga, Jasmine stood before a packed hall of constituents. She wasn't behind a podium this time. No lights, no press, just neighbors. You made this happen, she said, her voice steady. By showing up, by paying attention, by caring when the system counted on you to look away. A young woman in the crowd raised her hand. Would you do it again? She asked. Stand alone in that courtroom like that? Jasmine thought about it. The tension, the attacks, the risk. Then she smiled again, a little wider this time. I didn't stand alone. I just stood first. And the room erupted. Not in protest, not in pain, but in hope. For the first time in a long time, people believed the law might actually protect them.